So my name's Allie. So first things first, I have to make a disclaimer. Nothing I say is on behalf of any entity or government organization. I'm here at my own free will. This is just my experience. I don't want to go to jail. So here we go. So I have no experience in neuroimaging, very minimal. I've been taught things. Primarily, I'm a regulatory affairs person. So I work heavily. If you have an idea and you have a project that you want to do, I figure out how to get it done. So I'm everyone's kind of go-to girl of how do we get this done. So a little background about me is my background is actually exercise physiology. So my bachelor's is exercise physiology, and then my master's degree is exercise physiology. And primarily I worked with human subjects. So primarily with first responders. So firefighter, health and safety, FEMA related, federal emergency grant, how do we keep firefighters safe? From there, I left academics. So I have quite a bit of experience in academic research, but then I went more into educational hospital-based healthcare. And so I've been in research since 2019. As a career and working in industry-ish, I've been in research since 2022, heavily in regulatory affairs. And so I've done everything from drug, device, data, helping the bench side get things through. I've kind of had a taste of all of it. I took a viewing of all the posters. I see a lot of genetic-based research. I was a senior manager for a genetics program, so I did a lot of different gene therapy and pediatrics. So kind of have a lot of experience, not an expert in one thing or the other. But what we're going to focus on primarily is kind of when you look at the research timeline, you get an idea, you go through the literature, you identify the gaps, you establish a question. If it's good enough or if it has potential, you write the research proposal or you write the protocol. You may or may not go after funding. Typically, if you're in industry, everything is funded focused. So if it's not funded, you're not doing it. If you're in academic, if you're in school, typically you either get funding or you don't. Any regulatory institutional review board, IRB review, different institutions, depending where you are, they have additional processes needed for data acquisition. Or, for example, if you're working with pediatrics, you go through a whole other review process because that's considered a vulnerable population. We have to protect those vulnerable populations. And then the actual data acquisition itself, analysis, dissemination of results. What we're going to focus on, or primarily what I'm going to talk about today, is really the IRB review and then any potential additional review processes you may face when you're trying to get data. When you look at the research timeline, and a lot of times in proposals or grants, you kind of set up a timeline of how long is this going to take me? How long is this going to take me? This is when I think this will get done. And one of the things I repeatedly see when looking at or assessing proposals coming through is a lot of times we underestimate the amount of time you need for regulatory review. So you'll think that it's going to take like a month tops, and it takes 8 months to get your data, depending where you are. You run into a lot of hurdles. So first, kind of when we look at the IRB review process, I've submitted all sorts of IRB reviews. And the first thing you do is your IRB, depending what system it's in, you may be at an institution where you just email all your documents to an IRB email. You might be at an R1 institution that uses a system like Ethos, where you put everything into a portal. Or if you're at a government entity, they might use IRB Net, which is a whole other system. So there's all these different management systems that kind of help streamline operations of getting certain research approved. Based off of kind of what I'm seeing here, or what I'm going to assume is there's probably a lot of people trying to do stuff with databases. Most likely that's going to be an exempt protocol, meaning it's not going to go through a full review where it's really scrutinized for what you're doing. There's other protocols that may go through expedited review, meaning it might be greater than minimal risk. but what you're doing isn't too intense. So from an exercise physiologist perspective, if I was going to put someone through a cardiac stress test, usually those protocols are expedited. When we look at full review boards, I mean, we're giving people drugs or we're giving people devices. A full review board, it has to be scrutinized. They're looking at if you have FDA approval for eye exemptions and everything. And so with IRB review comes study staff evaluations and training. So if you're doing research with the IRB and you need to put it through IRB approval, everyone on your study team usually has to have GCP training, city training, and then your institution will designate certain trainings like HIPAA compliance if you're going to access patient data from a hospital system or electronic health record system, data and privacy trainings as well. So anybody that works on your project has to be approved and has to be vetted through the IRB and listed on your protocol. In addition, a lot of times what we're seeing in IRB processes is that each study staff listed on your protocol, they're assigned certain tasks. And we see it in greater in clinical trials. If I'm a study coordinator and we're going to implant a new device into a heart failure patient, I'm not going to be listed as the person implanting the device because that's insane. The surgeon is, right? And so everyone has their roles. The IRB will also look at your protocol to make sure that it's even feasible. So for example, it's easy to do with full review protocols because it's so much more drastic, but they'll look at your protocol and make sure that it can even be done. So if you have a diuretic and you want to give it to children and you put that through the IRB, they're going to stop you. Because for one, they're going to say, is this diuretic even approved for that indication in this population? No. Okay, well now you need FDA approval. So the IRB will scrutinize what you're doing. They'll make sure it's within what their institution can do. And they look at if it's the risk. Really, they look at the risk. They don't want a lawsuit, right? We want to keep everybody safe. And so then you have certain things of HIPAA authorizations and informed consent. Has anybody ever done informed consent in research or collected informed consent? Okay. So if you are just doing a data study that requires IRB approval, so you're just trying to access data, you're not interacting with humans, you will submit for waiver of written HIPAA authorization and waiver of written informed consent. And what that means is the reason why we have these documents is because a long time ago when we started doing research, we did a lot of bad things. Like we gave people syphilis and then didn't treat them. So we have to be like very careful and check all the boxes and be very ethical and make sure that we're treating humans correctly and animals. But going forward, if you have an exempt study and you are trying to access a database with like thousands of data points to do analysis on, it is not feasible for you to go and collect written consent from each of those people. Like that's not a thing. We understand we won't do that. And it's just not realistic. And so when you go to submit your IRB review, if you are deemed exempt, if it's a data study, you often get waiver of written HIPAA auth or waiver of informed consent. We also see waiver of HIPAA auth and waiver of informed consent in expedited or other exempt examples. So if you're interviewing people, we often see those get named exempt because it's not necessary. Of course, you usually get verbal consent because you're talking to someone. But in cases of full review, waiver of HIPAA authorization or HIPAA authorization and written informed consent are absolutely necessary. And so the bottom line is that the IRB approves what you give them. So if you write the protocol and you give them the protocol and they approve the protocol, you can't go away from what you said you're going to do. And so there's different instances where like this is more important and less important, or more riskier and less riskier. But the bottom line is you have to stay within compliance of your IRB, or you're at risk of what we call a protocol deviation. And it can sound really scary, but and I'll get to that. But when you look at the methods, when you look at assessing data, when you look at storing data, when you talk about transmitting data, all these things you say that you're going to do in your IRB review, you have to do it as you say it, or you're at risk of non-compliance. And that it institutionally varies, but it varies. An example of this is if you have data, and let's say you're collaborating with one university and then there's a second university. So you have university A and B. If you have de-identified data, usually you can't just send it via email to each university. You usually have to have safeguards put in place, especially if it has the potential to become identifiable again. If it can be re-identified to the patient it was collected from. You'll often hear things like data use agreements, which allows, or material transfer agreements. I used to send blood samples to different institutions depending on where they came from. Another example is in terms of IRB review, it seems easy, right? It seems rather straightforward, but there's examples that I have which it gets murky. So for example, I was on a study and it was a full review study. It was for a drug and it was with pediatrics. So it was with medically complex children. They had varying cognitive and physical delays in their development. So part of the study, and their parents were really desperate for them to enroll into this study because it was the chance that they may regain or be able to develop or get back on the track of development and be able to walk or be able to talk and be able to like self-feed themselves. So it was a very hot trial and like a lot of desperation to enroll their child. And so one of the situations when I came into it as a manager and like kind of looking over what we were doing, one of the first things you'll learn is if you have a study that requires informed consent, before you can do anything with the patient, you have to have written informed consent. And so I came into a situation where because these children were developmentally delayed, and to qualify for the clinical trial, they needed a urine sample. The parents were collecting the urine sample prior, just to be able to enroll them, to get them started prior to having written informed consent. And so usually you would think they did what they needed to do. And there was no malicious intent behind it. But the IRB flagged it and they said, wait a minute, you have to have written consent. So then we go back and we had to make an amendment and we changed to what we're doing and made sure that they could have written consent or digital consent prior to them coming to the campus. So that's kind of an example where your IRB, if something is if it's a protocol deviation and it's out of compliance, you don't necessarily get in trouble for it, right? But you have to make an amendment to fix the protocol. So that's one example. Another example is I had a protocol where there was no intervention, there was no device or drug, it was purely further diagnostics. So the opportunity for their child to get even more diagnostic testing that their insurance normally wouldn't cover under research. The IRB ruled, and when the study was approved, they said both parents have to sign consent. Well, the issue is not everyone has two parents. So how do you deal with those situations? And so when those things happen and when those flags come up, the best thing you can do is you just talk to your IRB. You talk to your IRB person who's assigned to you and you work through those challenges, because the option of ignoring it, that's not an option. And it's the same with data. When you need to transmit data and send samples everywhere, you just work with your IRB to get to the next step. And so it can really feel like this. And I think for the first 4 years of my career, it kind of feels like you submit a protocol and then your IRB sends you like a list of things you have to change in order to get it approved. And you don't really understand it. So you just start making the changes without really understanding why you're doing those changes or what the implications of it is. Or if you make these changes, you don't realize that this is going to change how you have to do things in the future. And so although it feels like you're jumping through hoops, the best thing you can do to set yourself up for success is when you go through that initial IRB approval or those initial couple years of working in research, that you understand why you have to do these things and what answers and why they need the answers they need. You know, one example is they always ask like where you're going to store the data. And it doesn't matter at every different institution I've ever been at. It's always been, we're going to keep it on this laptop in this building, locked in to a room that only X, Y, and Z have access to. And like, you know, I was thinking, this has come up in the last 6 months that I've been thinking about. I'm like, is that really the correct answer? Because the reality is you take that laptop home with you. And so what happens if there's what happens if someone breaks into your car and steals your laptop? How are you going to explain that to the IRB? And so I see a lot of times we see copy and paste just to get it through, but you don't realize the implications of that until it's in your face with something that happened. And so the best thing you can do is you just work through each step, and then the next time it'll be easier. So you get your IRB approval, right? And let's say you're going to you're getting a lot of data for the sake of this conference and what this is. And it's a data study. So you're going to collect a bunch of data on certain patient populations and you're gathering imaging, right? Some institutions, depending where you are, I've seen it at several, you get your IRB approvals and they just unleash you into Epic. Let's say your data system or your EHR is Epic, and you can just start pulling data from Epic. Let's say your PI has a patient list, you're great. And like some institutions, like this is just how it works. Maybe it's a REDCap, maybe it's a database, maybe it's a different EHR. But some institutions, depending on what data you're trying to get, you're able to just pull it. And it's so easy. So it's like within 3 months, it's like you have a publication ready to go. Some institutions, it is not like that. And some data systems is not like that. So you may get your IRB approval, but for example, like if you want to access certain protected NIH databases, you have to go through like it's called a data use certificate. Okay, your data use certificate has to be signed by your institution, authorized institutional person. So you have to figure out who that is. And then sometimes they may say, the big thing that you see is that says it depends on your institution whether you need an IRB or not. So in some cases, depending where you are, your institution may have you go and put through an IRB in order to get a data use certificate, in order to submit it to the NIH, in order to get access to it. And then you have to maintain your access. And so same with different education institutions. If you are trying to access government or federal data, you have to go through all these different processes or extra reviews. And so an example is we have IRB approval for a certain study. We want additional data, or we're listed to be able to collect death certificate data. Okay, well now we have to submit an application for that data and they review once a month. So now your process is just delayed again. And so one of the most important things is that you need to understand before you start a project, especially if it's for your education, your thesis, your dissertation, you need to understand or have at least some of an idea of where your data is housed and what is the process of getting it. Because if it's just like your research institution uses Epic and you can just go pull data from Epic, you're going to be fine. If it's much more hard locked and it requires like the chief of staff to sign off, it's going to be harder for you. And so with that being said, the other questions that are important to start asking yourself, and things I'm seeing in just the world we live in right now is, can you eventually, you have to, like, are there restrictions on AI or machine training models? So that's a hot topic right now, especially with our IRB, especially with different leaderships across several institutions, is people are kind of nervous about AI, especially your IRB review boards, I've noticed, because if you train a model, and I don't always use the terms correctly because that's not my area. But if you have an AI model and you're going to train data off of de-identified patient data, but when you have this algorithm or this tangible thing you've created, your institutions is going to get worried because it's like, well, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to send it? Are you going to publicize it? Are you going to make it available to the public? Is there risk for re-identification? There's a whole data security where people get really nervous, because the worst thing you can do is you train a model and then all of a sudden, like, you go within the algorithm or the code. I'm just speaking, I think that's how you say it. And then you're able to identify people. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. And so it's important to know, like, if you get access to this data, can you actually do what you want to do with it? Or is it restricted? Because certain data sets are restricted. Another important thing that we've noticed is, like, if you have this grand idea and you need data that fits these certain inclusion-exclusion criteria, what's going to happen when you thought you're going to have thousands of data points and you have 150? Can you actually do what you want to do? And so, like, power analysis, study designs, is the data you're collecting actually testing the hypothesis you want as well? I've seen it in clinical trials, like large trials, where the outcome measure they chose was not what they should have chose to answer the question they were trying to answer. And it's like, well, they just lost millions of dollars and their product is no longer going to industry. Like, that's terrifying. So just thinking through these questions before you actually dive into it. Oh, that again. Okay. So the best thing you can do is you really just have to take it step by step. And I see it all the time in research where people are looking at the big picture and they're like, how am I supposed to get to A to B the fastest way possible? And it's not real. Research is very slow. It feels very slow. And oftentimes, what if you get a negative result? So what if your p-value at the end of the day is insignificant? Are you going to publish negative results? Like, what are you going to take away from that? And so the best thing you can do is you just take it one step at a time and really think about what you're going to do before you do it and before you put through all the effort for regulatory processes and regulatory approvals, to make sure you get the results you want. So I skipped. All right. So going back, I was asked to talk a little bit about dissemination of results. So when you get to this point and kind of what this looks like. So obviously, I think what a lot of people are most familiar with is, like, you get results and you make an abstract or you write a publication or a manuscript or you present it at a conference. Like, that's what I think a lot of people are doing. And that's kind of what we're introduced to. And more so kind of other end products that have kind of been coming up more recently, at least in my work, is patents, IP, future or seed funding, and what that looks like. And to be honest, I have no idea because it's not my area of expertise. I'm not a patent lawyer. I'm not an expert. I'm not a businesswoman at all, but I'm in the conversations. And so I can speak a little bit from my experience of what that looks like. And so first and foremost, my understanding is if you create this algorithm and you have this tangible product, right, and you need to protect it or you need to make sure that you have the rights to it or whatever, it is my understanding, the first and best thing you can do is your institution, wherever you're doing research at, wherever you're employed by, who you're affiliated with, they should have the resources. So they hire people who know how to do this, especially at your big RO1 institutions. They have lawyers, they have people who do the applications. Like, your best bet is your institution has the resources. But it's also, in my experience, and I'm not saying this is for everybody, but your institution usually has right of first refusal. So if your IRB is housed there, the funding for the initial project was through there, the institution has the right to the product to patent it. With that being said, those conversations are murky. I haven't been a part of a ton of them, but that's why we also have patent lawyers. Also, for patents and IAPs, they take decades. So in my experience, what I've heard is they can take years. It's a long process. I personally don't have a patent, but I work with people who have patents, and it's very costly. It costs money to file them. And so your lab needs to have the funds to do it. But also, if you have to hire a patent lawyer, lawyers aren't cheap, so you deal with that. But your best case scenario is your institution should have the resources. The next idea, or kind of what you look at, is seed and future funding. And so we're seeing it more often. Has anybody seen Shark Tank? I love Shark Tank. It's so good. I watch it all the time. Okay. So what we're seeing now, or conversations that I've been a part of, is like, especially when pharmaceutical companies come through with products and they're trying to get the drug to market, is they're rolling the drug into a business, right? Once they get FDA approvals and everything they need. Same with, like, I'm thinking how we can relate it to these talks, but same with algorithms or any AI machine learning thing, they're being rolled into businesses. And so the idea is, especially now with kind of, we're unsure with what research funding is going to look like in the future, there's a big push or a big kind of anxiousness to roll it into businesses so that people can stay afloat. What I've been a part of is people often take their findings and they put it towards larger funding mechanisms. So an example of that is when I was in graduate school, my research, unfunded, but it was preliminary data, and it became a FEMA grant. So now the University of Kentucky, they have a $1.2 million FEMA grant. So that is something that has then funded that lab for the last 5 years, which is great. And so the hopes with it is it takes a long time to get from your initial project idea to here, but it's possible. And you just hang in there. And if all else fails and you don't know what to do, or you're confused, or if you feel like you might make a mistake, you just call your IRB and they will help you. They're not meant to police you. They're meant to help you. Same with if you're at a larger place, you usually have a regulatory affairs person. You have them help you get the answers. So with that being said, does anybody have any questions? Any situations you want to run by? Yeah.
I don't have a very specific one.
Yeah.
I don't have a particular example,
Okay.
a specific one, or like a particular problem I'm trying to solve, to be honest. So this is more of a very general question, and I hope this doesn't really sound like a rant or anything.
Oh no,
like that
you're
about
fine. We can rant.
It sounds like as our understanding about the risks associated with data and data analytics keeps increasing and our scope keeps expanding.
Yeah.
The regulatory authorities keep putting more and more rules in place, but the infrastructure to deal with them lags behind by order of magnitude, and this lag, I feel like, keeps increasing almost.
Yes.
And the burden that is put on us researchers keeps getting bigger and bigger and larger. Like, I remember when I started my PhD, like this was almost a decade ago, these problems, sure, we knew about this, but they were very doable. Now, every step you take, it's, do you have a lawyer? And it's okay, maybe I could just do research. And then at the other side, at the same time, instead as private citizens, we have, like, it seems like also like our data is constantly our responsibility to protect.
Yes.
And these companies somehow, they just can use it for whatever they want, however they want, as long as we have clicked the right thing in a particular app on our phone.
Yes.
So my question to you is, we don't know this rant, is the situation getting easier or better? Like, what are the tools that we can use to bridge this gap, or is the community trying to shrink this gap between what is expected to do and what we can actually do, especially for say for example in small institutes realities, like if I don't come from Harvard and I come from a very small independent institute, we don't have all of that. Right?
Yes. So
thank you.
Of course. So the best thing you can do, so if you're coming from a small institution, right, you don't have all these regulatory affairs people, you don't have a large staff, the best thing you can do, and I can speak from my experience, is I don't have all the knowledge. I also don't have a ton of resources. So it's just, I handle all of our, in my position, I handle all of our regulatory affairs. It's on you. You have to educate yourself. So for example, next month, I'm taking a SOCRA exam. It's Certified Research Professional Certification Exam. And so you have to meet certain criteria, but what they have you review is understanding of GCP, good clinical practice, data security, all the federal guidelines. And so that's one thing I'm seeing people, especially people my colleagues do, who feel like we don't have all those resources of like, well, what do we do next? Is to the education. So educating ourselves on federal practices, how to move in certain areas, especially with AI and machine learning. That is, I think, is what's really scaring people right now, is that it feels there's so much unknown with it that everyone's immediate answer is to just say no, is to just stop. The other advice I have, and I've done it at every institution I've been at a handful, every institution I've ever been involved with, I find a person who is in IRB or in regulatory affairs, and I cling to them. And I teams them so much, but I just find that person and I network my way into their discussions and I just hang out with them. So my privacy officer, my IRB officers, like every institution I get hired at, I become their best friend. I send them memes. I'm like, hello, I'm here and I need help. And you can never email someone too much, in my opinion. You just keep going at it. And so I don't think, the bottom line is it's getting harder and it feels like it's getting separated more and more, but you just have to be persistent and just know. And at some point it's okay if you just take a break for a week on a project. We have several projects where I just like take a break and I'm like, this is a regulatory nightmare and I'm going to go work on something else. And thinking of ways, well, if they're telling me I can't do X, Y, and Z, what if I propose a new way? And so it sounds, I don't have a solution, but it's, you don't give up and you network your way to the meetings where you sit with them. And if they reject something you submit, you say, I need to talk to you about it. And you call them. I call everybody. That's my advice. Any other questions on anything regulatory? Yeah.
Real quick.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. But thank you so much for that presentation. I just wanted to highlight, like, within the context of everything going on and how crazy things have been in the research world, you mentioned patents as a step forward. Patents.
Oh, patents. Yeah.
Okay,
No, you're good.
patents as a step forward. And I'm here thinking that's so much more expensive than even the research that we're trying to do. So then are there bodies like NIH, for instance, that could probably help this become more accessible in a way that they see this as a future of putting the ball in the researcher's court as opposed to the direction things have been going all this while. So it's like, this is a new era and we have to start thinking outside the box. We have to start doing things differently. Yeah, so that's just my question. Is there a way that these patents could be better accessible?
Yeah.
Or are these conversations you're willing to start having with your best friends, the IRBs?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And my first answer when we're starting to look at the shift that's happening, we're having to all pivot. We're all pivoting is what it feels like. How many of you, raise your hand if you work and do anything with budgets? Do you do anything with budgets? A little bit. Okay. What I'm going to start doing, this is my public service announcement. What I'm starting to do is when I start budgeting, I'm budgeting for that. I'm budgeting at least for the startup costs. Because here's the thing. Part of it is if you're at a bigger institution, your institutions collect something called IDC or indirect cost. And so it's kind of like, if you have a grant and you submit for research funding and it has 15% IDC, your administration can collect an additional 15% within the budget for administrative indirect costs. And so ideally, if your administration is collecting those IDC, and this is my opinion, but if your administration is collecting those IDCs, they should at least, and it's a larger institution, they should have the resources to help you with that process. But if they don't, and you're from a smaller institution, I don't see a reason why you can't start. There's probably a reason why you can't, but my initial pivoting idea for that is to budget for it in the grant applications going forward. I don't know if that's a perfect answer. I'm sure there's a bunch of red tape with that. But that's what I'm going to start doing until someone tells me I can't, because that's kind of what I do. I just hit red tape. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you suggest
come over.
Would you suggest then people start using, are there like external companies, like if we have budgets for it, right? And the internal institution we have doesn't really guide you, cannot really do the work for you.
Yeah.
A lot of us are researchers. We not only we don't know this stuff, we don't want to know this stuff particularly.
So fair.
So if we have money to pay for it, what's the landscape out there of maybe like private company who literally scope is only to do this for you?
Yeah, it's there. That exists.
Okay.
It just costs money. Everything costs money, but that exists. It's just, and once again, I go back to networking because there's people in your field who are doing this actively. And so it's like, I see the conversation, I see my emails come in all the time where I have PIs and they say, well, X, Y, and Z over at this institution is doing this, and I want to do it too. Can we do it? And I say, let's have a conversation, get the company on the phone. Like we sign a legal things, but yeah, I think we're in a pivoting point where you really you're going to fall back on your network, and everyone's going to kind of have to gel together and just ride the wave. That's what I'm doing. Yeah.